हेलो एवरीवन, आज हम करेंगे courtier poets and court politics. Most of the well-known poetry of the period was written by courtiers or or by highly educated gentlemen and was rarely published. Poetry was written more for a small circle of friends and others of similar rank, addressed to a nobleman usually. Following the practice of patronage by the nobility. पहले तो ऐसे लिखते थे ना फ्रेंड सर्कल के लिए, बाद में जो लिखते थे लोग उनको पैट्रोनेज मिलता था, मीन्स कोई आदमी कोई नोबेलिटी का आदमी जो है उनको पैट्रोनेज करता था, मतलब उनको पैसा देता था. But it was, as we have noted, following the practice of patronage by the nobility. But it was, as we have noted, common practice for courtiers of the period to lay claims to being poets. There is some controversy about how important their self perception as poets was to them, and to the social meanings and implications of this perception. It is probably true that the poets of the Elizabethan period, from Thomas Wyatt to Walter Raleigh, John Davies, were first courtiers and then poets. Critics like Richard Helgerson, वो उन्होंने काफ़ी कुछ बोला हुआ है, argue that most of these poets, while projecting the craft of poetry as being of divine origin and advertising its civilizing effects, and the poet as teacher, ये थोड़ा सा एक just wait. Afflicted inspirer, etc., to monarchs, refuse to see themselves in these ten in these just wait huh? In these terms. Okay. uh, Contrarily, for most of them, poetry was merely an indulgence about which they remained largely defensive. The risk of assuming the garb of poet as they envisioned the vocation was too potentially threatening to their social status, with the possibility of exposing its wearer to ridicule and shame. मतलब वो नहीं दिखाना चाहते थे कि वो पोइट हैं. Thus, while acknowledging the importance of the figure nationally, according to Helgerson, most of these poets were unwilling to offer their own work and themselves as worthy of acknowledgement in these terms. They instead offered apologies for their work, blaming it on the passion on the passions of love or a lack of suitable employment, often promising never to repeat their pretensions to poetry again. Their complaints, however, were not against their conceptions of poetry so much as against their actual poetic work, which they felt was likely to be mocked, and in turn they themselves as poets. मतलब उनको लगता था कि उनके काम का मजाक बन जाएगा. The picture is, however, more complicated than it appears here. We must also remember that, firstly, self depreciation was part of the poetic conventions of the time and need not be taken as seriously as Helgerson wishes to. Very often, poets self reflexively indicated their art as insufficient to its own ambitions, generating a particularly poetic tension that was based on the paradox of the poem achieving its aims precisely by denying itself. This may be made clearer through the following lines from Sidney's Sonnet 34 addressed to his beloved Stella. ये बोलते हैं, what idler think then speak and not be heard, what harder thing than smart and not to speak, peace foolish wit, with wit my wit is married. Thus write I while I doubt to write, and wreak my harm in ink's poor loss. The basic point being made in the poem, and specifically is in these lines, is that there is an overwhelming reason to write the smart or pain of love in the second line, which is however hindered by the very passion it seeks to communicate with wit. My wit is mad. And in expressing the difficulty of communicating the passion, the poem achieves its precise aim, which is to project the measure of the passion as all consuming. Once we acknowledge this convention, it becomes clear that the poet's depreciation of his art was often not so much a matter of placing the vocation of the courtier above that of the poet as a matter of fulfilling a demand of the poetry itself. But in addition to this, we must also remember that such a pose of expressing an inability to complete, of embarking, means starting on a task that is beyond one's power, or of self-depreciation, etc., and so on, was not conformed to the poet or the vocation of poetry, but was considered the appropriate mode of self presentation for the ideal courtier, and extended to all of his various roles. This pose was assumed to indicate not so much humility as moderation and balance on the part of the courtier. It was an Italian ideal propounded by Baldassare Castiglione in his book, The Book of the Courtier, 1528, a very influential humanist text on courtiers of the 16th century, not least because it opened the question of whether a courtier is born one, or anyone from outside the nobility could also become one on the basis of his ability, accomplishments, and learning. It was read by many outside the nobility, especially from the emerging merchant class who wished to appear cultivated. This is an issue of significance for us because, as we shall see, Spencer was not born in the nobility, but nevertheless, education and accomplishments. Castiglione's book suggested not only that the ideal courtier was one who was graceful and educated, but that he be accomplished and many-sided in his personality, and yet remain inordinate, orderate in his presentation of his accomplishments. For the average Elizabethan courtier, this was extended in its implications to indicate loyalty and subservience to the monarch. It therefore took the form of self depreciation and was much practiced as a means of displaying one's accomplishments, even as they were belittled as a sign of inferiority before the queen. Sir Philip Sidney was to become a living ideal of such a courtier, but for an outsider like Spencer, अच्छा स्पेंसर जो थे वो बाहर थे, फिलिप सिडनी तो कोर्ट के ही थे ना. This was to become a problem. We will discuss some of these issues in the next unit when we discuss life of Spencer. For now, it should be clear that the writing of poetry and the practice of self-depreciation were both necessary dimensions of the politics of Elizabethan court and the self-presentation of the courtier there. Next video में we are going to do English nationalism and the Renaissance. Thank you so much.